Nobody expected this to be the headline after the Browns' collapse. The score alone was already brutal. A 31-3 loss, non-competitive. One of those games fans want to forget as soon as the clock hits zero. And at first, everything followed the usual script. Analysts rushed to point fingers. Clips of interceptions spread. The rookie quarterback became the easiest target in the room. But then something happened that completely changed the conversation. Myles Garrett didn't just defend his teammate, he snapped. Not emotionally, not recklessly. He did it with intent, with clarity, and with a level of frustration that made it clear this had been building for a while. Standing in front of reporters, Garrett made it known he was done watching false narratives get pushed about Shedeur Sanders. This wasn't generic locker room support. This wasn't "we've got his back" talk. Garrett directly called out what he described as lies, misrepresentations, and lazy takes that ignored the reality on film. And the reason it hit so hard is simple. This came from the most respected voice in that building. When a player like Myles Garrett speaks, people listen. He didn't deny that the game was ugly. He didn't pretend mistakes didn't happen. What he challenged was how those mistakes were being framed, and who was being blamed for things that never stood a chance to succeed in the first place. Almost instantly, clips of Garrett's comments went viral. Fans started rewatching the game. Analysts began backtracking. And a bigger question started circulating online. Was the media already decided on this story before the game even ended? Because once you strip away the box score and slow the film down, the situation starts to look very different. What seemed like a quarterback failing suddenly looks like a rookie buried under circumstances no first-year player should be judged in isolation for. And that's why this moment matters. Not because the Browns lost, but because one of the NFL's biggest stars just forced everyone to reconsider how young quarterbacks are being evaluated, and whether fairness has quietly disappeared from the conversation. And once Garrett drew that line publicly, there was no putting the narrative back in the box. The reactions started before the game was even over. By halftime, the tone was already set. Cleveland was down big. The offense looked stuck. And the broadcast began shifting into damage control mode, preparing viewers for the same storyline they've leaned on all season. When the final score read 31-3, most people didn't even wait for the post-game breakdown. They went straight to blame. And once again, that blame landed squarely on the rookie quarterback. On paper, it was easy. 3 interceptions, no touchdowns, constant pressure. A stat line that looks ugly no matter how much context you add. For anyone skimming box scores or watching highlights on mute, the conclusion felt obvious. Shedeur Sanders had another rough outing. But that surface-level reaction is exactly why this game spiraled into controversy so fast. Because while the media focused on Sanders' numbers, they largely ignored how the game actually unfolded. From the opening drive, the Bears controlled the tempo. Their defense dictated everything. Pressure came early and often. The pocket collapsed before routes had time to develop, and Cleveland never found a rhythm that allowed the offense to breathe. Meanwhile, on the other sideline, the narrative couldn't have been more different. Caleb Williams was praised for his poise, his growth, his command. And to be fair, he played well. He executed the game plan. He took what the defense gave him. He benefited from protection, balance, and a structure that functioned the way it was supposed to. But the contrast in coverage was immediate. Williams' success became proof of development. Sanders' struggles became proof of doubt. One was framed as learning. The other was framed as failing. And that shift happened almost instantly, before anyone took a serious look at why the outcomes were so different. That's where frustration started boiling over. Because fans who actually watched the full game, not just the turnovers, saw a rookie quarterback fighting uphill from the first snap. They saw protection breakdowns. They saw long developing plays behind a line that couldn't hold. They saw hits piling up, timing disrupted, and confidence tested snap after snap. Yet the post-game conversation barely touched any of that. Instead, questions about readiness, toughness, and long-term viability took center stage. And that rush to judgment is what made this game feel different from every other loss. It wasn't just criticism, it felt like a verdict. That's why this game triggered such a strong response. Not because the Browns lost badly, but because the reaction to why they lost exposed a gap between what people saw on the field and what they were being told to believe. And that gap is exactly what Myles Garrett wasn't willing to let slide. This is where everything shifted. Myles Garrett didn't walk up to the podium looking like a player ready to give the usual post-game cliches. There was no vague talk about learning moments or putting it behind us. Instead, it was clear almost immediately that he had something specific on his mind, and that he was done letting it slide. Garrett didn't just defend Shedeur Sanders as a teammate. He challenged the entire framing of the conversation surrounding him. What made this moment hit so hard was how direct it was. Garrett wasn't talking in hypotheticals. He wasn't saying the media was being a little unfair. He flat out pushed back on what he described as false narratives, claims that didn't line up with what actually happened on the field. And coming from a player of his stature, that carries weight. This is a defensive player of the year, level star, a leader, someone with nothing to gain by stirring controversy. And that's exactly why people listened. Garrett made it clear that blaming a rookie quarterback for systemic breakdowns was lazy. He called out the idea that Shedeur was missing reads or failing mentally, when, in reality, the pocket was collapsing almost instantly. He pointed out that people were criticizing decisions that were being made under conditions most quarterbacks wouldn't survive, let alone thrive in. This wasn't emotional defending, it was factual. He referenced film. He referenced timing. He referenced how quickly pressure was arriving. And by doing that, he forced the conversation to slow down, something hot take culture hates. Because once you slow it down, the easy narratives don't hold up anymore. What stood out most was Garrett's tone. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't ranting. He sounded frustrated, but controlled. Like someone who had watched the same story repeat itself long enough to finally say something. And that frustration wasn't just about one game. It felt like it had been building over weeks of coverage that kept missing the same point. Garrett also drew a clear boundary. Criticize performance if you want. That's fair. But don't rewrite reality to make it fit a headline. Don't ignore context to manufacture doubt around a young player's future. And don't pretend toughness or effort is the issue when the tape shows otherwise. That line matters. Because when a veteran leader publicly challenges the media like this, it's not just about defending one player. It's about protecting the locker room, setting a standard, letting everyone know that scapegoating won't go unchecked. And once Garrett drew that line, the conversation stopped being about one bad game. It became about accountability, not just on the field, but behind the microphone. Once Garrett pushed back, people stopped arguing and started rewinding. Because when you actually watch the tape, not the highlights, not the stat line, the story looks very different from the one that took over social media right after the game. The film doesn't show a quarterback freezing up or failing to process the field. It shows a pocket that barely exists long enough for processing to even matter. On most dropbacks, pressure is arriving almost immediately. Not exaggerated pressure, real contact. Defenders breaking through in under 2 seconds, sometimes faster. That's not enough time for any quarterback to go through full progressions, especially not a rookie still building timing with his receivers. This is the part the early narrative skipped. Several of the hits Sanders took came before routes reached their break points. That means receivers were missed. They simply weren't available yet. When people claimed he was holding the ball too long, the film shows the opposite. He's often forced to make a decision before the play has a chance to develop. And that matters. Because decision-making looks very different when you're throwing on rhythm versus throwing while bracing for impact. 2 of the interceptions came on plays where Sanders was hit as he released the ball. That's not poor reading of coverage, that's physics. When your base is disrupted mid-throw, accuracy and control disappear. The 3rd interception came late, with the game already out of reach. A desperation attempt. The kind quarterbacks are expected to take when there's nothing left to lose. That context somehow vanished from the conversation. What the film really exposes is how often Sanders is forced into survival mode. Sliding, resetting, throwing off platform, escaping to create space that should already be there. Those plays get labeled as reckless or undisciplined until you realize there was no disciplined option available. And here's the key point Garrett was making. Criticism without context isn't analysis, it's storytelling. Once you see how fast the pocket collapses, claims about missed reads and slow processing stop making sense. The tape doesn't show hesitation, it shows urgency. That's why Garrett emphasized timing so heavily. Football happens in windows, and right now, those windows are being slammed shut almost instantly. When that happens, outcomes lie. The film doesn't excuse every mistake, but it explains why they're happening in ways the box score never will. And once you see that, it becomes clear why Garrett was so direct. Because the film doesn't support the narrative being pushed. It contradicts it. And that contradiction is exactly what forced people to start asking harder questions. Not about Sanders' talent, but about why the tape was being ignored in the first place. This is where the conversation stopped being subtle. Because once Myles Garrett brought it up, everyone knew exactly what he was pointing at: the double standard. The way two rookie quarterbacks, in two very different situations, were being talked about as if the circumstances didn't matter at all. Caleb Williams played well in this game. That part isn't up for debate. He executed the plan, protected the football, and took advantage of what the Bears gave him. But Garrett wasn't attacking Williams. He was attacking the coverage around him. Earlier in the season, Williams struggled. There were games where he looked overwhelmed, games where the offense stalled, games where mistakes piled up. And when that happened, the response was patience. Analysts talked about growing pains, about learning curves, about needing better protection, more chemistry, more time. Nobody questioned whether Williams belonged. Nobody suggested the Bears made a mistake. Nobody rushed to declare his future uncertain. That grace mattered. Now flip the situation. Shedeur Sanders struggles in a game where protection collapses, weather is brutal, and the offense never finds rhythm, and suddenly the language changes. Now it's about readiness, toughness, whether he can process at the NFL level, whether the Browns should already be looking elsewhere. Same position, same rookie status. Completely different tone. That's what Garrett called out. He made the point that Williams is being evaluated within his environment, while Sanders is being evaluated in isolation. And that's not analysis, that's narrative building. One quarterback gets context added, the other gets context stripped away. What makes this comparison hit harder is that Williams himself handled it with class. When reporters tried to bait him into comparisons or subtle shots, he didn't take them. He kept the focus on his team, on execution, on what he needed to improve. He never piled on Sanders. Yet the media did it for him. And that's where the frustration really set in. Garrett wasn't asking for Sanders to be crowned. He wasn't saying criticism should disappear. He was asking for consistency. If rookie struggles are expected, then they should be expected across the board, not selectively applied based on market, momentum, or pre-written storylines. Because when coverage turns uneven, development suffers. Quarterbacks don't grow in headlines. They grow in structure, repetition, and confidence. And when one rookie is given room to breathe while another is suffocated by instant doubt, it creates a distorted picture of reality. That's why this comparison mattered so much. It wasn't about Williams versus Sanders. It was about fairness. And once that point was made publicly by one of the league's most respected veterans, it became impossible to ignore. Because suddenly, the coverage itself was on trial, not the quarterback. This is the part of the story that somehow got skipped, even though it explains almost everything. Because the moment the game ended, the conversation jumped straight to results without addressing the environment those results came from. And once you start layering in the context that was left out, the narrative around Shedeur Sanders looks a lot less definitive. Start with the weather. This wasn't a clean, controlled setting. The conditions were brutal. Cold temperatures, heavy wind, the kind of environment that changes how the ball travels, how receivers break, and how quarterbacks have to adjust their mechanics on the fly. Teams that practice in those conditions regularly have an edge. Teams that do, they're reacting in real time. That matters especially for a rookie. Then there's the protection. This wasn't just pressure. It was immediate disruption. The kind that forces throwaways, off-platform releases, and rushed decisions. Long-developing concepts were being called behind an offensive line that couldn't hold blocks long enough for timing routes to exist. That's not on one player, that's a structural mismatch. And yet, most of the early coverage treated those snaps like standard dropbacks. Weapons were another missing piece. Separation was inconsistent. Windows were tight. And when receivers aren't winning quickly, quarterbacks are forced to either hold the ball or force throws into traffic. Neither option is good, but one gets blamed far more often than the other. That reality rarely made it into post-game analysis. Coaching context mattered too. This offense hasn't been stable. Terminology changes, adjustments mid-season. Play calling that often asks for patience in situations where patience isn't being protected. That puts a rookie in a constant state of adaptation instead of progression. And then there's the psychological weight. Every snap feels like an evaluation. Every mistake feels amplified. When job security questions linger and media narratives snowball, confidence becomes harder to sustain. Quarterback play depends on decisiveness. Decisiveness disappears when fear creeps in, not fear of defenders, but fear of consequences. None of this excuses mistakes, but all of it explains why they're happening. That's the difference Garrett was pointing at. Not denial, context. Because when you remove environment, structure, and support from the conversation, you're not analyzing football anymore. You're judging outcomes without understanding inputs. And that's dangerous for development. Because once context is ignored long enough, narratives harden, labels stick, and rookies stop being evaluated on growth and start being evaluated on survival. That's why this section matters. Not because it deflects blame, but because it shows how incomplete the early reactions really were, and why any honest evaluation of Sanders has to start with everything that was happening around him, not just what showed up on the stat line. This is the part of the story that never shows up on film, but it affects every single snap. Because playing quarterback in the NFL isn't just about reads and mechanics. It's about what's happening in your head when everything around you feels unstable. And right now, Shedeur Sanders is carrying a mental load that most rookies are never asked to handle this early. Every week feels like a test. Not just against the defense, but against narratives, against job security rumors, against questions that usually don't surface until years into a career. When a rookie knows that one bad game can trigger benching talk, draft speculation, or front office doubt, the margin for error shrinks instantly. That pressure changes how football feels. Quarterbacks are taught to play free, trust their eyes, and let the ball go on time. But when you're constantly worried about consequences, hesitation creeps in. Not because you don't see the play, but because you know what happens if it goes wrong. That split-second doubt is enough to turn a clean read into a late throw. And that's where confidence starts slipping. What makes Shedeur's situation heavier is that the pressure isn't just internal. It's everywhere. Headlines questioning his toughness, analysts debating his future, fans reacting emotionally to every mistake, all of it piling up while he's still trying to learn the speed of the game. That's not development, that's survival. And yet, through all of it, Shedeur hasn't pointed fingers. He hasn't thrown teammates under the bus. He hasn't blamed coaches, weather, or protection in public. He's taken responsibility even when the situation around him clearly isn't functioning. That level of composure at this stage is rare. But composure doesn't mean immunity. The human side matters. Confidence is fragile early in a quarterback's career. Once it cracks, rebuilding it takes time, sometimes years. That's why veterans stepping in matters. That's why Garrett speaking up mattered. Because when a respected voice validates what's happening, it can steady a young player before doubt hardens into habit. Garrett understood where this was heading. He saw how easy it would be for the narrative to snowball. How quickly a rookie could stop playing instinctively and start playing scared. And he wasn't willing to watch that happen silently. This section of the story isn't about excuses. It's about understanding how pressure works, not the kind that comes off the edge, but the kind that sits on your shoulders between snaps. And if that part isn't addressed, no amount of mechanical fixes will matter. Because quarterbacks don't just need protection in the pocket. They need protection from narratives that can derail them before they ever get a real chance to grow. This is why this moment didn't fade after the press conference ended. Because what Myles Garrett did wasn't normal. Veterans defend teammates all the time behind closed doors. What they don't usually do is publicly challenge the media narrative, especially in a way that risks backlash, misquotes, or long-term tension with reporters. Garrett chose to do it anyway. And that's what makes this different. When a player of his stature speaks up, it sends a message that goes far beyond one quarterback or one bad game. It tells the locker room that scapegoating won't be tolerated. It tells young players that someone with real credibility is paying attention to what's actually happening, not just how it's being spun. That matters for development. Rookies don't just learn from reps, they learn from how their organization responds when things go wrong. Silence can feel like agreement, and when veterans stay quiet, narratives harden fast. Garrett stepping in disrupted that process. He slowed it down, forced people to rewatch the film, forced context back into the conversation. That alone changes the trajectory of how this season is talked about. It also exposes something bigger about modern football coverage. The rush to label, to declare, to predict futures based on a handful of games isn't harmless. Those labels stick. They follow players into contract talks, into locker rooms, into fan perception. Garrett wasn't just defending Shedeur, he was pushing back on a system that rewards speed over accuracy. And once that system gets challenged publicly, it can't just brush it off. This moment also reframes how we evaluate leadership. Leadership isn't always about speeches before kickoff. Sometimes it's about stepping into uncomfortable territory when someone else can't. Garrett didn't gain anything by doing this. He risked headlines. He risked being labeled too emotional or making excuses. He did it anyway because he believed the coverage had crossed a line. That's rare. And for Shedeur, it matters more than any stat correction ever could. Knowing that a respected veteran sees the full picture and is willing to say it out loud can steady a young quarterback in ways coaching adjustments can't. This wasn't about erasing criticism. It was about recalibrating it. Because once fairness re-enters the discussion, development has room to breathe again. Mistakes can be evaluated without becoming verdicts. Growth can be measured without panic attached. That's why this moment matters. Not because it guarantees anything for Shedeur Sanders, but because it reminded everyone watching that narratives aren't neutral. And when they start drifting from reality, someone has to be willing to pull them back. This time, that someone was Myles Garrett. When everything settles, this moment wasn't really about one blowout loss, one bad stat line, or even one press conference. It exposed something much bigger that's been quietly shaping how young quarterbacks are judged in today's NFL. What Myles Garrett did forced everyone to slow down. He didn't erase Shedeur Sanders' mistakes. He didn't pretend the game went well. What he did was demand honesty. Honest film study. Honest context. Honest conversations about what a rookie quarterback can and cannot control when everything around him is unstable. And that's where the real issue lives. The modern football conversation moves fast. Too fast. One game becomes a verdict. One bad afternoon becomes a projection of an entire career. Context gets stripped away because nuance doesn't travel as well as outrage. Garrett stepping in disrupted that cycle, even if only for a moment. What this really exposed is how fragile early narratives are, and how dangerous they can become when they harden too quickly. Quarterbacks don't develop on timelines set by social media. They develop through repetition, confidence, and support. When those things are missing, talent gets buried under noise. And once doubt becomes the dominant story, it follows a player long after the situation changes. That's the part Garrett refused to ignore. He understood that if this narrative continued unchecked, it wouldn't just affect one game or one season. It would shape how Sanders is viewed every time he steps on the field. And that kind of weight is unfair for any rookie, especially one navigating constant pressure, organizational instability, and public scrutiny all at once. This wasn't excuse-making. It was perspective. Garrett reminded people that fairness matters in evaluation. That film matters more than headlines. That patience isn't weakness, it's necessary. And most importantly, that young players deserve room to grow without being crushed by conclusions they haven't earned. Now the question is whether Shedeur Sanders will respond. The question is whether the conversation around him will. Because this moment drew a clear line. Either coverage becomes more responsible, more contextual, more grounded in reality, or it continues to chase narratives that feel good in the moment but damage development in the long run. What Garrett exposed wasn't just media behavior. He exposed how quickly football forgets its own history. Every great quarterback struggled early. Every one of them needed time. The difference is whether that time was allowed or taken away by noise. And once you understand that, this story stops being about a loss in Chicago. It becomes about whether the league, and the people who cover it, are willing to learn from the same mistakes they keep repeating.